Hello to those of you who have joined us already. Thank you so much for joining IHEC for today's webinar. We will take a few short moments to wait for others to hop on with us, and then when we get started with today's event. Thank you. Okay, everyone, we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to today's webinar titled Connecting the Positive Psychology Movement to Prevention Efforts. My name is Emma, and I will be the moderator for today. I am the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, or IHEC for short. I am very excited to be hosting today's event. So before I introduce the speaker and hand over the microphone, I'd like to go over a few little housekeeping items first. If you are new to using the platform GoToWebinar, on the right of your screen, you'll see a control panel. This will be your best friend, what you can use during today's program, especially the question little panel on it. You can type into that little question panel if you have any questions throughout today's program, and then we can get to them at any point during the webinar or at the end if we did not get to it during. All attendees will be muted throughout today's presentation, but we do encourage you to use that question box at any time if you do have a question or if the presenter does ask any questions where he would like your feedback. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, James Larkus. James serves as the Project Manager for Strategic Initiatives at the Health and Counseling Center at the University of Denver. So James, thanks so much for joining us, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone's doing well wherever you may be watching. And it's nice to, I guess, virtually meet you. I wish we were able to do this in person, but the blessing of technology is that we can all be in our respective institutions or wherever we may be to talk about this issue and to talk about AOD and prevention efforts as it relates to positive psychology. So I'm really excited to present this. This is the first time that I've sort of combined both of these topics together. I have done a lot of my work previously with positive psychology and coaching in particular, holistic wellness coaching. But really, as I have been working in the health and wellness space for about 5-6 years now, really seeing the connections that it has and seeing it actually happen kind of at the same time within the AOD and prevention type spaces. So I'm excited to kind of share this with you all today. Hopefully, the way that I present is hopefully something is left that's meaningful to you. I'm not doing this for my own sake, so please, as was mentioned, type in any questions. I want this to be as much of a dialogue as it can be, even though it is virtual and from afar. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we'll be focusing on today. So I introduced myself, but I would like to get a little straw sort of poll of who is potentially here. So if you don't mind going into that chat box and actually typing in what functional area and or role that you may serve wherever you may be watching this right now, just so I can get a sense of who's in the room and hopefully maybe tailor some of the examples and or some of the content to the people who are here.
Yep, so if everyone could go ahead and take just a few seconds to type that into the question box, that would be very much appreciated. We do have a few so far. We
So far,
have
looking
assistant.
in. Okay, wide scope. Thus far, we're on campus, 4-year public school. Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. If more come in, that would be great. But I'm seeing that there's sort of a trend here that we're working either in AOD prevention, health promotion offices. So all sort of in the same general area, which is helpful for me to know. So hopefully this will be relevant to you all. And please continue to use that box should things come up. So since it sounds like most of you are going to be or are already working on a college campus within AOD work, some of the beginning stuff may not be too new to you, but at least it situates us and hopefully frames why I think positive psychology can be an additive and complementary sort of piece to what we're traditionally doing on our campuses relating to prevention and to alcohol and other drug use. So as we go into the next step, if I can transition the slide here, this is getting a little bit older now, and I haven't seen a new one come out recently, but I always find this striking, and I start most of my presentations out with this. So when you see here on the screen is a survey done or given to the Chief Student Affairs Officer at universities across the United States and within the NASPA sort of umbrella. And as you can see, related to health, wellness, and safety, you can see broken down by region, what are the top things that these Chief Student Affairs Officers, so your Vice Chancellors for Student Life, your Vice Presidents for Student Life, your Dean of Students, whatever it may be called where you are, this is what they're seeing and what they are potentially wanting or needing to work on their campus. So you can see right across the board, which I think is really interesting, mental health across the board is the #1 issue. But as you see sprinkled through, and there's a lot of intersection between a lot of these, as we all know, is looking at alcohol abuse is #2 all the way across the board. And then you get into some other things related to suicide prevention, sexual assault, illicit drug use, prescription drug use, which I think since this has been done a couple years ago, would probably be on the rise just based off of the experiences I've heard, not only here at the University of Denver, but also at other institutions that I've worked with. But you can see sort of the myriad of health and wellness issues as it relates to what Chief Student Affairs Officers are really focusing on. So not surprising, but I think it just shows how there are so many things that we are doing, that we address on our college campuses and the important work that each of us are doing. So my goal today is to think about, okay, so how are we trying to alleviate some of these health and wellness concerns, not only from an administrative perspective, but really to enhance the student experience as well. So not just thinking of it from an administrative perspective, but really from that student perspective and seeing how positive psychology, again, can be additive for that. So some more stats and figures for you just to kind of build the case. What you'll see here on the next slides are so the blue line is the actual use and the green is the perceived use, in this case for alcohol. So what I've done is I actually went to the National College Health Assessment from the past couple of years from the spring summaries and have put that data in here just to kind of see how things have changed and in some ways not changed over the course of time as it relates to alcohol use. So you can see in spring 2015, the actual use for students who are using alcohol within the last 30 days, that's what this question was taken from, 59.5%. And now in spring of 2018, we have 61.3%. And then as you look at the perception, so peers perceiving their peers to be using alcohol within the last 30 days, 92.1% of students perceived in 2015 and 92.4%. So not really much of a difference, and it seems pretty flat with a little bit of a spike there from 2015 to 2016. So same question, but different substance. Cannabis. So cannabis use I think this, as you can see, is a huge gap in terms of the reality between perception. And I can say that for where I'm situated, especially in Colorado, our data is very, very striking in terms of the perceived use because of the state laws that are here in Colorado. But as you can see, in spring 2015, 15% used cannabis or marijuana within the past 30 days. And now in spring of 2018, it's up to 19%. So there is sort of a change there. And then from the perceived use, actually gone down a little bit, but pretty much the same as it was in 2015 to 2018. Now, I wanted to focus primarily on AOD because I know that's the focus of IHEC and a lot of the people who are here, but I don't think that we can talk about AOD use without also talking about the potential mental health issues that are on campus, especially when we look back to that first chart looking at NASPA, Chief Student Affairs Officers, and the things that they are focused on. So I did the same thing here, just shown in a different way to highlight the people who have identified that they felt overwhelming anxiety. And as you can see, it has gone up consistently from 2015 to 2018, all the way from 56.9% to 63.4%. And then when you change the question again, so to felt overwhelmed by all you had to do, again, a little bit dips, a little bit up, but generally the trend has been going up. And again, I just pulled these from the last couple of years. The nice thing about the ACHA NCHA survey is that you have all the reports from prior years, so we could take this back. But I just wanted to kind of show a snapshot from the past couple of years and maybe the life cycle of most of the students who are on our campuses right now and what they're answering for some of these questions. So the last sort of question that or I guess data point that I have here is for people who felt very sad. And this one is a little bit more flat, but you can see again, there's still pretty high numbers in relations to that question. If you were to think about the amount of students you have on your college campus right now, or I guess spring of 2018, 68.7% of them have identified that they felt very sad within the past 30 days. I think that's striking and something that the institution, obviously, and all of us who work in this field want to help alleviate and or help students build capacities for. But that's a striking number to really think about. And if people do feel very sad, they feel overwhelmed by all they have to do, overwhelming anxiety, the last three sort of mental health questions, I think a lot of times that's what leads to a lot of substance use on campuses across the country. So my question for this is, so we have all that data, we've seen that data before, but how do institutions typically respond? And from my perspective, we respond primarily in two ways. And the first one I would say is we have really robust and have continued to have robust treatment on campus. So that could look like mental health treatment, it could look like medical treatment, where we have clinicians within our either integrated or non-integrated health and counseling centers across campus who are really trying to help alleviate some of these sort of health and wellness issues that we're seeing. And just to kind of, people here probably know what it is, but I think it's striking just to kind of read what the definition is from the dictionary about what treatment is. And it's the administration or application of remedies to a patient or for a disease or an injury, often known through therapy. So I think that is a natural response. If there are things that are either of risk or of things that could potentially be detrimental to a student's success and or their health or well-being, it makes sense to have treatment-based or clinical services on college campuses as a way, to help remediate what's going on for those students. So that's one way. I think we constantly look at the clinical side. So I'm using college counseling centers as an example of this to sort of, again, build the case. But you could use this with your medical stats as well. I don't have as much knowledge in that area and or access to the data. I know our anecdotal experience here at the Health and Counseling Center at the University of Denver as our numbers are going up. But I just want to use the College Counseling Center in particular as a way to sort of highlight this point. And this stat actually comes from the Educational Advisory Board, where they have a report that they put out in terms of meeting demand for mental health services, targeted interventions for key student segments. So the Educational Advisory Board kind of did all this research across the country to kind of, they kept hearing through all of their programming and all the things that they do for higher education that mental health was a big thing, so they wanted to study it more. And what they found is that from 2009 to 2010, that academic year, to the 2014-2015 academic year, college and university college counseling centers utilization grew 5 times faster than the actual enrollment at U.S. institutions, which I think is really striking. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. I think higher education has done a really great job in terms of trying to be more accessible. Our institutions are more accessible than they maybe ever have been. We still have a lot of work to do, but maybe that's a reason. So we have access to higher education for people who maybe in the past did not see higher education as an option because of a potential diagnosis or chronic disease or things of that nature. I think we've done a lot in regards to breaking down stigma. You always hear that, I feel like, at every health and wellness conference, is how do we break down the stigma to not only health services, but in particular counseling services. I think we've done a really great job chipping away at that block. Again, lots of work to do. So maybe that is why there are more students who are coming and utilizing our college counseling centers. But there might be other reasons too, which I would, I always try to engage in a dialogue, is a little harder to do here, but to think about what are those reasons. But just as an objective fact, that is a pretty striking number in terms of how fast and how much our college counseling centers are not only growing, but also being utilized. So I guess more to the growing part of that statement, another piece that I've taken from the Association for University of College Counseling Center Directors is that 35% of college university counseling centers gained full-time staff in 2017, which is great. We're getting more support administratively to support the mental health and well-being of our college students, which is really great. I can say that from our perspective here at the University of Denver, we fall into that category. My previous institution, I was at Ohio State University. Our college counseling center staff grew, I think, every year that I was there, both as an undergraduate, graduate, and full-time staff member. So we're not only having higher utilization, which I think is allowing universities to say, hey, we need more staff. But another fact here is that college counseling centers continue to gain staff members at a much higher level than losing them. So I know there's a lot of health promotion staff here. I hope this is not the case for you all, but I know it sometimes is the reality for smaller offices if you're not integrated. But the thing here is that college counseling centers, as they gain FTEs, they are not losing them in the same way that sometimes when people either leave, they move on. Some of those full-time staff members are reevaluated and maybe pulled back into the larger unit and or the larger division. I know that happened a couple times throughout my tenure, not only here at DU, but also at Ohio State. Anytime a full-time staff member leaves, it's a time to reevaluate where can we allocate that. But for college counseling centers, it's not very likely that they are actually losing that full-time staff member. They just continue to add onto their sort of base number. And just the stats below it, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. 7.9 staff gained for every 1 staff lost. And that's up from 6.3 just 1 year ago. And this, again, report was in 2017. But that's a pretty striking number to see just within 1 year, the amount of growth for 1 staff loss, that ratio. The rise in these health and wellness issues as well. What is it and how else does it impact college counseling centers? Based off that same survey I was just referring to, 1 in 3 college counseling centers have a wait list. The average wait time, according to this report, is 6.7 days. You're probably looking at the other side and saying, what's the 17.3? The 17.3 is for those that do have a wait list. So the 1 out of 3, the third of the population that does have a wait list, the average wait time for students to get in is 17.3 days. Sorry, I'm just getting a drink of water. So what does this all mean? This is all just these stats that are being thrown at, but I think we're seeing mental health issues rising. We're seeing institutions respond by providing more treatment or clinical services, and yet we're still not able to meet the demand. Students are constantly trying to access our services. We're increasing staff, but I think this quote is really sort of telling, and it comes from that EAB report, is that institutions with well-resourced counseling centers, which I would say maybe not all of them even are, but even those who do have quote-unquote well-resourced centers, they're still seeing extreme demand and significant challenges in meeting that demand, which means that the solution is not more counselors. It may be a short-term answer, but it's not a long-term solution. This really stood out to me, and sort of another way to put it as I had conversations with people is that it might be sort of a static solution to a dynamic problem. We're seeing something that we've never really seen on our college campuses in relation to health and wellness, and we're just trying to throw more bodies at it, if you will. And I'm not saying that those added counselors are not great, that it's not helping alleviate, but it's not fully maybe addressing the root cause. So there's something more going on here, and I think is why maybe a lot of the health promotion offices around the country have started to arise, not just now, but in the past, is to think about things in a little different way. So we had, like I said, how do we typically respond as an institution? Well, we provide treatment or clinical services. That's one way. I think the other way, and in the title of this presentation, is then we do prevention. We understand that there's education, there's awareness, there's outreach. There are things that we can do beyond the traditional one-on-one and/or group clinical services that allow us to reach more people, hopefully try to get on the front end of things. And as it says in the actual name of it, prevent some of these health and wellness challenges from actually happening. So again, treatment, prevention are the two ways that I see most regularly that we actually respond, and I have them sort of mapped onto the illness wellness continuum, which is something that I think is becoming more and more of a focus, especially within the health promotion space, is to be thinking about, we do have a duty and a responsibility as institutions to not only treat and or remediate some of the things that are on the left side of this equation, so the treatment paradigm. I think we want to make sure that we're alleviating those signs, symptoms, disabilities, or potentially even on the worst case scenario, premature death. But we also then have a responsibility to prevent those things from happening from a perspective that we don't want to just wait until those things are bad. We want to help prevent it. And you all probably know this from your own experiences, but I also think that there's sort of an interesting sort of gap here. Because from my vantage point, preventing bad things from happening is not the same thing as cultivating well-being or cultivating an experience that we want. If I prevent the flu, that is wonderful, but that doesn't mean that I have vitality on campus. That doesn't mean that I'm engaged on campus. That doesn't mean that I have a sense of belonging on campus. And so I think there's also a little piece that's missing here in terms of prevention, really focusing on awareness and education, but also this idea of growth. How can we actually create a process, create an ecosystem where people can grow into their best selves and grow into those high levels of well-being? So that's where I feel as though the field has been, just giving a general brief skimming of where prevention efforts in relation to AOD and or mental health are at. But I really feel that we can augment and enhance our response through positive psychology to really focus on also providing those high levels of wellness or that growth aspect. So before I jump into sort of positive psychology and how it potentially can be this additive piece, I wanted to take a brief moment, stop, drink some water, but also give you a chance to ask any questions about some of that first sort of initial data set and or framing. So if you want to chat, put anything in the chat box. I think Emma is going to help moderate for me, and I'd be happy to sort of answer any of those questions before we move on.
Yeah, thank you, James. So go ahead and type in anything to the question box if you have anything coming to mind thus far. Otherwise, we'll just keep on moving forward in a few minutes.
And I will be not offended if you don't, but I just want to make sure there's space and time.
We don't have anything so far.
All right, well, I'll keep moving. If they do come up, please let me know. But again, I think that's a lot of probably review for a lot of people, especially if you have been working and do currently work in this field. So I'm going to jump straight in and talk about positive psychology. So this is where I've had most of my experience. I have worked as an undergraduate working with strengths-based positive psychology-based initiatives, as well as grad school, and influencing into my professional work for the last 5 or 6 years, as I've said. But it's a newer branch of psychology that focuses on the techniques of psychological theory, research, and intervention to more fully understand the positive, the adaptive, creative, and emotionally fulfilling aspects of human behavior. Okay, cool, fancy definition. And the other easy way to put it is for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, we have asked the question, what goes wrong with people? And we've learned and gleaned a lot of information from that. It has helped us immensely. But this movement said, can we learn just as much if we ask what goes right with people? Could we potentially also then have interventions, insights, and practical applications that allow people to either remediate or to treat things that are not going so well, but at the same time also then try to cultivate that high level of well-being if we ask the question, what goes right with people? So the branch of positive psychology is relatively new as it relates to sort of disciplinary fields, but that is sort of the definition. Where did it come from? If you look at this very stoic photo on the left, we have Dr. Martin Seligman, who actually is kind of tapped as one of the founders of this positive psychology movement. He was the president of APA, and during his presidency, they all have sort of a hot button issue or something. They have an agenda, a platform that they want to push forward. Positive psychology was really his sort of addition to his presidency and the platform that he wanted to push forward. But before that, he is trained as a psychologist, and he is most known for a topic known as learned helplessness. I apologize for the potential sort of graphic nature of this, but the picture that you see there is actually the study that he did. And so what would happen is they would put animals, dogs, in a sort of little room. As you can see, there's a little divider there. And on the bottom, if you can see, it's labeled shock and no shock. So on the left side of that divider, there is an electric shock that would be given. Nothing that was, deadly, but it was something that's uncomfortable. And when the shock would happen, as most of us, I think we would do, it'd say, ouch, I don't want that. I'm going to go to somewhere else. So you would jump on over to the non-shock side. What's really interesting about this study is how they came up with sort of this term of learned helplessness, is that as they were doing these studies, they would first kind of start off with the shock on the whole floor, and the dogs would ultimately, when the shock was happening, they would not actually jump. They would just stay and sort of take the pain of what was happening, because they had learned that there was nothing that they could do. So it's sort of a negative sort of, it's not the brightest or most rosiest of studies, but it was a really big development within the psychological field, and it could, applies to a lot of different things, that there is this sort of trait or this sort of mindset that is developed, called, he called learned helplessness. When things go wrong, we just sort of kind of take it and ride that wave and ride that spiral as it continues to go downwards. But as he sort of progressed in his career, he came up with something then learned optimism. So this is after his positive psychology movement as president of APA. And his progression of thought said we could potentially overcome negative ways of thinking by learning from the past, savoring the present moment, and forecasting future achievements. So whereas the learned helplessness is looking at the past, thinking we can't change, kind of just being in the moment and knowing that nothing else can happen other than negative things, and dwelling on past failures and or past sort of pain. This was his potential new way of thinking that could help people get out of ruts that they may experience. This led to the emergence of positive psychology in his first book that was called Authentic Happiness. And happiness in his mind, so instead of the illness, if you look at that spectrum from a couple slides ago, but really sort of wellness or happiness, it's as measured through three constructs in the beginning. It was positive emotion, what he would call the pleasant life, engagement, which he would call the good life, and meaning, which would be the meaningful life. And he said that all three of these elements, when working together, when in, I won't say balance, but each aspect as important facets of a well-rounded experience, you would achieve happiness. So I want to actually kind of pause here real quick and say, based off of that, what are your thoughts? Are there any things that you feel would potentially be missing if you were to say there needed to be a model of happiness or well-being other than these three things? Positive emotion, being able to think positively about what's going on, feeling good, being engaged, sort of that experience of flow or liking what you're doing, maybe losing track of time, but really being fully engaged with the aspects of your life, and meaning. Would there be any things that you would say is potentially missing from that initial early model? And I'll kind of ask if you could type those into the question box. And or if you agree, we can agree.
Yeah, we do have some responses.
Okay.
We have self-awareness,
Okay.
also a positive climate, connectedness, and potentially the enjoyment of life.
Awesome. Yeah, those are really wonderful responses. I appreciate it. I'm always fascinated to hear what people say regarding these different elements. But regardless of what you call them, I think there are some missing elements and some things that you sort of hit on that as this field emerged, sort of developed into hopefully being a little bit more robust, a little bit more holistic. So if you think of the first model here, it was called sort of PEM. I don't know if you called it at that point, but you can think of it as PEM. Model, positive emotion, engagement, meaning, the first letters there. But the refining of the positive psychology movement really moved into what is now called the PERMA model of well-being. There's also different models that are out there now called PERMA-V. But as you can see, the first PEM still stays, so positive emotions are the essential part of our well-being. Happy people look back on the past with gladness, look into the future with hope, and enjoy the current moment. We have engagement. When we focus on doing the things we truly enjoy and care about, we can begin to engage completely with the present moment and enter the state known as flow. And then the meaning, we're at our best when we dedicate time to something greater than ourselves. This might be religious, community work, family, politics, charity, you name it, something larger than ourselves. But the two pieces that they added, which I think in some ways were related to some of the answers that you gave, relationships or connectedness, I know was a word that was said, that we are social creatures and that relationships matter. And while those relationships may contribute to meaning or to engagement or make us feel good, it is potentially an important enough construct to be by itself that we really need people in our lives and value others. The other one is accomplishment. So there is a sense that it's not that I have to be quote unquote successful or be on that sort of hamster wheel sometimes that there is, or the ladder of trying to be successful, but it's the idea that if there's something that matters to you, that you are able to do it. So to describe it as everyone needs to win sometimes. To achieve well-being and happiness, we must be able to look back on our lives with a sense of accomplishment that you can say, I did it and I did it well. So for instance, it doesn't really give me meaning or purpose or accomplishment to say that I can be a pole vaulter. I really don't care about that, but it does matter to me that I am able to be a good friend, or that I'm able to accomplish things at work related to college student well-being. That is something that really matters to me. So that is a sense that will contribute to my happiness, to know that I have the skills, the ability to actually look back and say, I can go out and accomplish things that matter to me and say that I did it and that I did it well. So I mentioned PERMA V. The V kind of relates to another one that was mentioned in the chat box. V kind of now standing for vitality, but this like this energy for life that is sort of, again, distinct enough potentially from these other entities, but it's this vitality and energy to be able to do the things that matter for you. So a sense of kind of purpose as well. So before I move on to how do we connect the positive psychology movement to prevention, AOD, mental health, all of those health and wellness issues that we see, I want to just address some of the misconceptions and or hear or talk about some of the maybe the criticisms to positive psychology, because they are out there for sure. But first and foremost, oops, I skipped over a slide. Positive psychology is not about being happy all the time. A lot of times when I've shared or talked about this, people say it's just a Pollyanna view of the world. It's rainbows, it's butterflies, it's unicorns, and that's just not a realistic appraisal of what life is like. And I would say you are right. So these pictures here, they're a little small to read, but they just kind of highlight this. So there's a really good book actually that's cited there at the bottom, When Likes Aren't Enough, A Crash Course in the Science of Happiness. This is by Dr. Tim Bono, who is a professor at WashU St. Louis, teaches a psychology class, sort of a science of happiness, if you will, course. That's one of the most popular courses at WashU, as are those sorts of courses elsewhere around the country. But through research that he found and has done, actually say that the happiest people are only happy about 70% of the time. It's not realistic to be happy 100% of the time. If you are, good on you. I want to be your friend, but it's just not a realistic sort of view or a realistic experience. But the happiest people are happy about 70% of the time, and they're not so happy or they don't like what's going on about 30% of the time. There's also this idea that there can be too much happiness, that there's actually, you need to have some sort of level of discomfort, challenge to actually grow. So there's a lot of research that's going on in the field that's saying that, again, it's not 100% of the time, but we actually need some of that challenge in our lives, and sort of this rebound effect that we, if we experience something really, really good or really bad, that we have to have the ability to be resilient and to bounce back. The second one is a little bit more maybe provocative, or maybe not provocative, counterintuitive probably is the word, but that positive psychology is not even about being happy. And when I first read that and sort of saw it at face value, I was like, wait, what? But the way that it's sort of described in the literature, and I think it makes sense, it's more of a semantics thing, is that it's not a state that we ultimately reach. It is not, thank you for coming to this iHeck webinar. You are now a well human being because we talked about positive psychology and its connections to all these different things. It is not a checklist item. Positive psychology is more about creating the conditions and the environments in which people can become happier, to create agency, to build capacities, to allow people to move towards what their best self may be at that point in time, knowing that it may change. So there is a really great quote that I had that I took out just because it was really, really long. But positive psychology is really more about creating the conditions in which people can see and hopefully create agency towards moving towards being happier or more well. I actually like well-being more than happiness, just a personal thing. But really thinking about that it's not just about being happy all the time, and it's not even about being happy. It's happy. It's about being happier, or being able to see things that could allow you to enhance your well-being. So again, I kind of mentioned this again, but this is sort of a summary. So it is focused on what they call a life worth living. It is focused on building capacities for success, health, relationships, and preferred ways of living at all levels. I don't know why there's so many bullet points there, but that's really what positive psychology is all about. And it's been intriguing to see it happen, as I said, sort of at the same time, but also intermixed with not only the mental health sort of space, which is where I think positive psychology has been used the most, but also seeing it in prevention and sort of promotion-based work as it relates to AOD. But before I move on, I wanted to, again, kind of stop, see if there's any questions as it relates to what positive psychology is, what it isn't, any criticisms, any feedback, anything that you may be thinking about at this point.
Perfect. So the same thing. We don't have anything at this point, but if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or contribute, you can do that now.
And if people are typing, one thing I didn't mention that I do think is worth noting, one criticism I hear a lot of positive psychology is that it's very white, it's very affluent, and I think that those are really, really good considerations. A lot of times I feel like the work in wellness, and the last time I sort of presented on some of these topics was having a really, really good discussion with people at NASPA Strategies about kind of the whiteness in wellness, and how this field is emerging, and because it's new, there's not as much research on how does this apply to potentially marginalized populations, or is this just a field that people who have means can sort of accomplish the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy, if you will, so the self-actualization. But if I can't even have the foundation, the basic security, food, shelter, those sorts of things, that this is not something that can be potentially applied. And I think that that's a really, really great point, something that I've been wrestling with, reading up a lot about. And if you want to talk more about it, I'd be more than happy to sort of engage in that sort of conversation offline. But I think it's something that's worth noting. It is a very valid critique, and it's something that I think the field is wrestling with right now. But Emma, are there any questions right now, or should I move on?
Yep, we did get a question.
Cool.
And it is, how is positive psychology connected to the buzzword of resiliency, and how might it be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, resiliency definitely is a buzzword, not only in higher ed, but all over. I would say this is probably an oversimplification of it, but resiliency is sort of a construct within the positive psychology field. So if you were to do positive psychology Google search like studies, I would say that a lot of them are studying resiliency as a construct that allows happiness or well-being to happen. And happiness or well-being has been sort of under the umbrella term of positive psych. So if you think of the field of not just positive psychology, but the field of well-being, resiliency is one of the major constructs, but it's something that floats all around because it's, like you said, a really big buzzword right now because it can be applied in a lot of different settings, but it is probably one of the most studied constructs of positive psychology that I've seen out there. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but I think they really interrelate, and resiliency is more of a construct that relates to it rather than maybe its own field. And there's people probably who would disagree with that, but that's sort of the way that I conceptualize it.
Perfect, thank you. And that is the only question that we had at this time.
Cool. All right, so how do we connect positive psychology to what we're currently doing? Like I said, we are doing really great treatment or clinical services. We have really robust prevention-based efforts. Can we then also incorporate positive psychology to either enhance prevention and or sort of to promote capacities? So let's bring it back to this idea of substance use on college campuses and the prevention work that we're doing with it. The one thing that has been, I think, a really big sort of light bulb moment for me as I've progressed and thinking about this and sort of expanding my knowledge, because I started more in the mental health space, but knowing and seeing the connections of mental health and AOD and substance use, is how substance use for a lot of times is meeting an unmet need, for other, for in this case students, but for people, that they are not using, potentially for a myriad of reasons, but a lot of times it's filling a gap, it's filling a missing puzzle piece in their life, that takes away that pain, that takes away that isolation, that takes away that, sense that, I don't like my current reality, whatever it may be. There's a lot of different reasons why people use, but I think centering the idea, or when you work with students, thinking about what need is it potentially filling, and how can we potentially work with them to find an alternative way to fill that gap, to fill that puzzle piece that might be there. So there's this quote here. This is a little bit longer. It is from an older study, but it just really kind of hits home for me. This is a quote from someone: "I was necessarily ignorant of the whole art and mystery of opium taking, but I took it, and in about an hour, oh heavens, what a revolution, what an upheaving from its lower depths of the inner spirit, what an apocalypse of the world within me. That's my stomach pains had vanished, was now a trifle in my eyes. This negative effect was swallowed up in the immensity of those positive effects which had opened before me, and the abyss of divine enjoyment thus suddenly revealed. Here was a panacea for all human woes. Here was a secret of happiness." So this is someone who, was a heavy user, was an addict. And a lot of times when we think of how these situations of students or people who come to us who are talking, about their use, I think a lot of times, or historically, maybe I think we are progressing quite a bit. We have asked the question of like, why do people take it? Why do people take opiates, for this example? Why do people take, other substances, use them, abuse them, or sorry, misuse them? And I think a lot of times it's like when you read this quote, for me, it's like, well, that sounds lovely. That there is a, it takes away all of my pain. It's a secret to happiness. It's just I think the question is why, instead of asking why do they, it's why do others not? And I think that gets into some of these elements of positive psychology, where there is this idea that there are things that, go into, a person's experience that allows them to feel more connected, to alleviate some of those woes. And I think this is where health promotion really comes in, and how it can help with prevention work. So health promotion is more closely connected to the concept of capacity building than treatment, and emphasizes a need to explore opportunities for action across multiple levels of influence. It's a process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health, and moves beyond a focus on individual behavior towards a wide range of social and environmental interventions. So when you think back to that quote, it's like, health promotion allows us to move past this one individual behavior, but really to create an ecosystem. And I know that was one of the things that was said, what's missing in this model. It's sort of this environmental, is kind of what I heard, environmental, capacities or environmental situations that allow people to be happy or to be well. That we are focusing on what are those unmet needs and how can we actually fill those in ways that, isn't by, substances. And that will allow us, to really focus on, again, that right side of the equation. How are we building awareness? How are we doing education? But also how are we allowing people to grow? So I think a lot of our prevention efforts is really primarily focused on things like, do you know your standard drink size? Do you know the, percentage of alcohol that is in a standard drink size for particular substances, so that punch that you're having on campus is not one drink, that's actually maybe 5 or 6 or 7. We're doing basics K6 work. We're giving people safe drinking strategies, so alternating between water and alcohol, eating beforehand, all these different things that we know help prevent bad things from happening or the negative effects of alcohol. But I think positive psychology's really focusing on what are the different things that we can do as health educators, as wellness, ambassadors, sort of on our campuses, that allows people to fill those things that are potentially being met by substances. So how do you feel a sense of belonging, healthy relationships? How do you feel engaged in your current situation rather than resorting to a substance to potentially fill it? And that's where sort of the growth comes in, and where positive psychology, I think, is additive to what we're currently doing around awareness and education of either the negative things that are happening, but also I know we're doing a lot of awareness and education around what positive things we want for students, but really focusing on growth. So one example I want to kind of put out there a lot of times, and I think this is a little bit more, I don't know if it's outdated is the question, or is the right way of saying it, but you know, a lot of times people will just say, especially if they're not working in this field, if you're drinking very heavily, just saying, you know what, why don't you just try an abstinence model? And this comes from a lot of the work from Miller and Rolnick and motivational interviewing, which I think a lot of you are probably familiar with if you're working in AOD or health promotion space. But in some ways, that view of trying to help someone with their AOD use is maybe kind of counterintuitive. If you say, don't use this thing that's filling this unmet need, then the person who is sort of trying abstinence kind of has this, like, what's in it for me? There's nothing that I'm not getting what I need. It's not gonna work. Relapse is really high, and sort of potentially a backwards way of thinking in relations to how we can actually promote success within people. And that's where I think motivational interviewing really arose as a field to really try to hit on the motivations for and reasons against change, rather than just trying to take everything away. So this sort of example, I think, is really prominent, but how can we, again, cultivate programs, initiatives, services that allow people to fill the needs that they are missing, but not saying, well, just don't do alcohol. Like, that's one way to do it, but then how do we also complementary do programming or things that allow you to feel a sense of purpose, things of that nature. And that's what this slide is really focused on. So instead of just saying that, how can we then instead in your life, working with people, how do we cultivate positive emotions about yourself, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment? Again, going to quickly stop here before I go into some of the positive psychology practices and what's actually being used in AOD, sort of the blend of those two. But I'll take a quick little break unless there are any objections.
Yep, we can do that. There is no questions at this time, but if anyone has any, feel free to write them in.
Great. Yeah, and for the sake of time, I want to make sure I get some of these things. So if you have them, type them away. We'll try to get to them at the end, or we can connect offline. But the way that I've seen positive psychology initiatives or interventions being used specifically as it relates to AOD use, mental health, and sort of the prevention work that's going on. One of the most famous studies or I guess interventions that's been replicated for positive psychology is the idea of 3 good things. And so 3 good things is an intervention where you actually at the end of each day would write 3 things that you're grateful for. It can be an experience, it can be a person, it can be anything related to what happened that day, but it's getting you to reflect upon what are the good things that happened in your day. And the reason we do this is because our brains are actually wired to kind of encode the negative, mostly as a survival mechanism. But we don't actually take time to, or our brains don't actually take time to encode positive events in our lives. So a lot of times we're walking around the world with an inaccurate ratio of negative to positive in our heads. And so 3 good things has been used quite a bit, especially as it relates to AOD use, substance misuse, as a way for people to be able to reflect upon the good things that are in their lives, to build those capacities and to build those aspects of their lives that potentially are being missed, and having them actively reflect upon them. The second one, and I am going through these quicker than I would normally like to just because of the time, but another intervention that's commonly used as it relates to AOD prevention and promotion-based work is the idea of your best future self. So instead of reflecting on the past and saying what led to your use, what's going on, what were circumstances that allowed you or enabled you to seek out some of these things, or to move you towards using substances, the idea is, what is your best future self? what would you ideally how would you like to ideally experience the world? What would positive relationships look like in your life? What would positive sort of engagement, if you were to be so engaged with what you did, and what would that look like? How do you want to talk to yourself? What are those positive emotions? What sort of accomplishments would that look like? Having people sort of articulate the future sort of solution focused scenario in their life has been shown us to be a beneficial way to work with people, instead of trying to sort of dwell in the past and to dig down into what led to some of the use. It's actually getting to articulate what they would actually like to experience in the world moving forward. So best future self is another positive psychology intervention that's commonly used here. The other one, which I have used mostly with people in general and also in relation to AOD use, is the VIA Character Strength Survey. This is a free survey based in positive psychology. Actually, Martin Seligman was one of the founders who created this instrument, but it's free, it's online, you can take it, and it spits out for you different capacities or character strengths that everyone possesses. So you get a full list of 24. It's not like Gallup where you would get 5 particular if people have taken that, but it gives you these words of different capacities or muscles that you could use and flex to accomplish what you really want to in life. So the way that I've seen this really play out and be super effective for people is that instead of immediately going to that negativity bias that we sometimes, and I would raise my hand, all have about ourselves, is that this says, you know, we all have a capacity for bravery or for zest or for prudence or for forgiveness. So what would it look like to exercise these positive capacities in a way that makes sense for us? If I could say, give myself a little bit more forgiveness for that last time that I used substances, or for the time that I failed at my job, whatever it may be, using those capacities as ways to help buffer sort of that learned helplessness that we talked about earlier, or this negative patterns of thinking. These are just really, really critical pieces that could be used and reframe conversations very quickly from a deficits-based perspective to a strengths-based perspective. Again, this survey is completely free. It can be taken online right now. And it's actually really cool as well because people can set up for like an administrator portal so that everyone that comes to you would use a specific link, and then you as an administrator could have access to everyone's reports and then run reports on that to see frequency of character strengths, all those sorts of things, which is really, really great. So I went through those quickly, but those are sort of the 3 bigger interventions that I have either personally used or seen, because I want to give some practicality to this presentation as well. But I really wanted to set the frame of, traditionally we have responded with sort of clinical treatment. We have then moved into prevention, and I think positive psychology can only enhance those efforts, but also really focus on what does it look like to promote holistic and true well-being on campus as a way to kind of help what we're currently doing, knowing that health and wellness issues are constantly arising. So at this point, I just wanted to leave it open for questions. I know we have a few moments. And again, I'm happy to connect with you offline. I'm just going to change slides so you can have my information in case we can't answer it now. But are there any questions right now that I can answer?
Thank you, James. Not at this point, we don't have any yet, so we can wait a few minutes. But want to thank you so much for taking time to share your experience and your knowledge with us. We actually do have one that just came in.
Yep.
It is, what about students who are not using alcohol or drugs to fill a void?
In terms of how positive psychology can be used, I'm assuming. And if that person can type back, that's great. If not, I'll kind of start with that answer. I think positive psychology in general allows us to broaden the spectrum of how we're currently trying to address health and wellness needs. I use AOD as a specific example because I know it's a particular large focus on campuses, but positive psychology in general, even if they're not using, can allow people to not just survive their college experience, which a lot of times I've even seen in marketing materials, especially as it relates to grad students, how to survive or your survival tips to your first year. That's not what I think we should be doing as institutions, is just getting people through. We, I think, have a duty and responsibility to also really cultivate critical thinkers, engaged, meaningful relationships, purpose, all those other aspects. So I think positive psychology can only enhance the full student experience, not just in relation to AOD as a particular health and wellness issue.
Awesome, thank you.
I don't know if that's what they were asking, but that's where I'm going.
And we don't have any more at this time.
Okay, well, I appreciate everyone for joining this call. I hope it was meaningful. And again, I'm more than happy to engage in dialogue offline because I know it's hard to do it here. So if you have any questions or comments, concerns, feedback, I welcome it and just appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Thanks for sharing this maybe new lens that some of us hadn't thought about with prevention efforts and things like that. So definitely appreciate it, and I hope that you all have a good day.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Thanks. Bye.